So hello and welcome to the spring series of the UEA Postgraduate History Research Seminar. We're a hybrid seminar series, so we'd like to say hello to our online audience tonight, our audience in the room, thank you so much for coming, and to our speakers tonight. We've got hybrid speakers as well. We've got Benjamin Anderson is joining us online from the University of Edinburgh, and we've got Sandra Browne from UEA is going to be joining us here with us in person. So we're going to start first with Benjamin. Benjamin is a PhD student and United Empire Loyalists Association of Canada scholar at the University of Edinburgh. His research project is primarily on Loyalists in Vermont and the Northern Borderland during the American Revolution. And the title of his paper tonight is Vermont, Ethan Allen and the American Revolution. So I'm going to get Benjamin to share his screen.
So yeah, thanks Louise. I'm from the University of Edinburgh. My research project is on Vermont and the Northern Borderland. Specifically, my project focuses on the Loyalists in Vermont and Northern Borderland. But because of the pandemic, I've not actually been able to get to see my sources yet, so it's still kind of work in progress very much. And I started the PhD during a lockdown, so I had to make do with what the sources I had at the time, which were the papers of Ethan Allen, who was a self-proclaimed leader of Vermont. And so the sources have kind of taken me down this avenue of allegiance in America during the American Revolution. And one way to do it today is look at the allegiance of Ethan Allen during the American Revolution, and in the process look at how Vermont and Ethan Allen experienced the revolution. So we'll start with the history of Vermont, because in order to understand Ethan Allen's allegiance, we need to understand Vermont's complex history prior to the Revolutionary War, then the life of Ethan Allen, and finally the allegiance of Ethan Allen. So here we go. Vermont. Green mountains, picturesque landscapes, Ben and Jerry's ice cream, and of course Bernie Sanders, that's what it's all known for. It's located in the northeast of the USA, as it's circled on the computer there for you. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, knew that already, but I just feel like I had to get it out there, because it seems to be whenever I mention I'm doing Vermont to someone, they automatically go to Canada. So no, it's in the USA. It's kind of a forgotten state. It sits up there doing its own thing, just chillaxing, and yeah, it gets forgotten. It's kind of neglected by historians, and this is particularly the case when we look at the historiography of the American Revolution. And during the historiography of the American Revolution, the historians generally only give Vermont a couple of paragraphs at most. Some give them a few sentences. It's not uncommon for historians also to actually admit to ignoring Vermont. For example, one historian says that they weren't going to study Vermont because, quote, it was sparsely populated. But by the 1775 and the Revolutionary War, Vermont actually had a population of about 20,000 people. And the difference between Vermont and the other colonies was that Vermont was actually a region rather than a colony. It didn't become a colony until, well, it became self-proclaimed independent republic in 1777. Before then, it was just a region, and it was called the New Hampshire Grants. So here we go. This is it right here, and it demonstrates the ill-defined nature of colonial borders during the 18th century. And they were very hazy, and it was claimed by Massachusetts, New York, and New Hampshire. Now, the first settlers to arrive in the New Hampshire grants were from Massachusetts in the 1720s. They generally populated the south in Fort Dummer, just down here. And by the 1740s, the region became an exclusive tug of war between New York and New Hampshire, for Massachusetts kind of relinquished its claim to the land. So the tug of war was instigated by New Hampshire and Benning Wentworth. This fellow on your screen looks like a young Brendan Gleeson, in my opinion. He takes advantage of the haziness of colonial borders for his own ends, to make his own profits. And he starts to issue land grants beyond the Connecticut River into this region of land, because he believes that the New Hampshire border extends to 20 miles east of the Hudson River, just like the Massachusetts border. So he gives all these land grants out at cheap rates to his friends, families and political allies. and they become known as absentee proprietors because they don't actually reside on the land. They live typically in New Hampshire or around about New England. They then sold the grants on to settlers, commoners and farmers in New England, usually in Connecticut at a higher rate, and Benning Wentworth would take a slice of their profits. So he became a very wealthy man through this process. By the 1760s, he'd issued probably about 1 million acres of land there, and he royally ticked off New York by his actions. For New York claimed the land to be their own. They insisted that it belonged to them through the 1664 charter issued by King Charles II. So Cadwallader Colden, he is the on-again, off-again New York royal governor, and he's at the forefront of these protests in the 1760s and early 1770s. He takes them out to King George III in 1764. And then George III comes down on New York side. He says that in the Royal Proclamation 1764, the land is under New York jurisdiction. Now, the Royal Proclamation, it causes more harm than good. It's ambiguous language, and he actually fails to definitively settle the issue because he neither voids nor validates the land of the settlers that are living there. And in the actual proclamation, he uses the words, the Connecticut River is to be the boundary of New York. So New Hampshire grants settlers, they seize upon this and they say, well, what he's saying is that New Hampshire can no longer issue land grants beyond the Connecticut River. New York, on the other hand, are saying, well, he's actually confirming that we did possess jurisdiction over the land grants, over this land, prior to 1764. Therefore, the land grants are illegitimate. So Colden starts to issue his own land grants. Usually, these are on military. These are usually military grants. They are on unoccupied land. But he starts to realise that he can make a bit of money here himself. So he starts to issue land grants, like Benning Wentworth, to his friends and political allies in the 1770s and the 1760s. And all in told, he issues about 80% of the land grants in that period, and they amount to about 2 million acres of land. So of course, by the 1770s, when it's got to this huge amount, they see New York land grants overlapping with New Hampshire land grants. And so tensions start to slowly rise between the settlers on the New Hampshire grants and the New York authorities. Now, I use the word supposedly here because even today, which is something like 300 years on, something like that, it still causes issues with the historians today, as I've realised from a recent blog post I made. It still causes a bit argy-bargy. So I'm going to use the word supposedly here. So supposedly New York wanted the settlers to pay expensive quit rents for residing on the land. Now, revisionist historians insist that New York that wasn't really the case. New York were more than happy for the settlers to reside there so long as they were developing the land rather than acting as absentee proprietors, which would mean the land would go to rack and ruin. But either way, tensions continue to increase, and by 1769 they almost reach a boiling point at James Breckenridge's farm just outside Bennington. And these New York surveyors, they come up to the northeast of New York, and they're demarcating new county lines and land patents. And so they arrive at Breckenridge's farm with the authority saying, look, we're here to demarcate these lines for the county, we've got to do our job. Breckenridge is having none of it, he's not happy at all, and so a tense standoff takes place between the two, and about 60 farmers then come along to support Breckenridge, and the surveyors are driven off. So now violence was narrowly avoided. But in the aftermath of this, there was then the ejectment trials, where New York plaintiffs, some of them were friends and allies of Cadwallader Colden, took out suits against 9 settlers from Bennington and Shaftesbury, and this included James Breckenridge. And this is when Ethan Allen arrives on the scene, and he becomes one of the representatives of the settlers in the court. Ultimately, the settlers are defeated in the court. New York Supreme Court comes down on the side of the plaintiffs, and they pretty much rule that the settlers are living on the land illegitimately, illegally, and they are now liable to be ejected by New York authorities. And there's different stories to this as well. Again, you have to use the word supposedly, because there's different angles to it. And this is partly being driven by Ethan Allen. So on the one hand, we've got the traditional story that's been concocted by Allen, that the New York Supreme Court was always going to find in favour of the plaintiffs because it was corrupt, and they were all friends of the plaintiffs, and they owned land in the New Hampshire grants. We've then got the divisionist story, which blames Ethan Allen and Benning Wentworth for the defeat of the settlers, because the New York Supreme Court told them that they had to go, Allen had to go and find paperwork that confirmed Wentworth's right to issue these land grants. Now, of course, no such paperwork existed, and the court came in favour of the plaintiffs because the settlers couldn't show any evidence to back up their claims. So who is this Ethan Allen that I've just mentioned? Because it's almost like he comes out of nowhere, and to me it feels like he comes out of nowhere, and there's a sort of mythical element to him. To me, he is to Vermont what George Washington is to the United States, as especially in the 19th century. He's this mythical character, this guy, this founding father that the population and the political elite use as inspiration in times of crisis and turbulence. So how do we describe Ethan Allen? He's a colourful character, to say the least. My personal favourite story is that he is walking down the street in Connecticut, and he sees these two guys coming towards him, and he believes these guys have done him over in a business deal. And so he starts shouting and bawling and swearing at them and challenging them to a fight. So he gets, as we say in Scotland, he gets lifted and he gets taken to the courthouse. And this is where it gets better, because then he goes to the courthouse and then he starts shouting and bawling and swearing at the judge. And for some reason, he then starts to strip in the middle of the courthouse. So he was some mental person, but he was a character. He seemed like such a great laugh, actually. And so, in all seriousness, he was a leader, he was a statesman, a businessman, he was a philosopher, he was passionate about Vermont and its settlers, but more than anything, he was passionate about his family and the land that they owned. He was also a drunk, he was rash. Traditional historians might say he was brave, but in my opinion, he was rash. He was arrogant, he was a loudmouth, and he enjoyed mythologising himself so he could strike fear into the New York authorities and inspire the New Hampshire grant settlers. So he arrived in the New Hampshire grants in the late 1760s after a decade of hurt and misery. 1755, his father dies unexpectedly, and he was very close with his father. And this forces him to return home and give up his education. He then has several businesses fail. He gets banished from towns for his provocative ways. He's blasphemous and drunk all the time. He gets involved in court cases. So he arrives in the grants as a broken man, I would say, and he finds a peace in the grants that helps him to kind of recover himself. So he arrives and he proclaims himself the settlers' leader, and he proclaims himself the Colonel Commandant of the Green Mountain Boys. I don't know if maybe you've heard of them as well, probably. They are an informal militia, or were, that committed themselves to protecting the settlers' land against encroaching Yorkers. And in the aftermath of the trials, he transformed the Green Mountain Boys from this defensive militia unit to an offensive one that goes on the attack against the Yorker authorities and settlers. They used terror, and when I say terror, they destroyed livelihoods, they destroyed the settlers' homes, they publicly humiliated them. So they really struck terror into the Yorker people. Meanwhile, simultaneously, he also uses propaganda. So like I said, he was a philosopher, he had these ideas of liberty, as I'll come on to in a minute, but were influenced by his father. And he spreads this propaganda through pamphlets and the newspaper correspondence, especially with the New York royal governors. And so at the start of the Revolutionary War, he leads the Green Mountain Boys, among others, including Benedict Arnold, in the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. And it's the first major US victory in the Revolutionary War. So high on the success and ever the rash fella, he thought he could take Montreal with a tiny army in September. But he's defeated and captured by the British, and he remains in British captivity until 1778. So what happens in New Hampshire Grant whilst he's away? Well, foremost, the New Hampshire Grants become the independent Republic of Vermont on 15th of January 1777. It becomes a self-proclaimed independent state that's trying to join up with the Union. In the summer of 1777, Britain then invades the US with the Champlain Valley, and it goes through western Vermont, but it's defeated at Saratoga, and it's forced to retreat back to Canada to regroup. Allen then returns to Vermont in 1778. Now, one of the most intriguing aspects in Allen's life is his allegiance, and for all his mythologisation, he was in fact no different from the vast majority of the colonists who experienced the Revolutionary War. And when we think about his experience in this event, the importance of his father can't be underestimated. His father taught me early on about the importance of familial self-preservation and how this can be achieved through successful land speculation. And on New Hampshire Grants, Allen finds this abundance of land that he could then use for his own ends to secure his immediate family and his wider family. So him and his family create this company called the Onion River Land Company, and they accumulate about 75,000 acres of land, worth around $275,000 by 1775. And it's a hell of a land empire to possess, and it's at stake now from New York in his eyes anyway. And it's at stake from New York, and it was quit rent and what Allen, among other settlers, believed to be different political system and societal norms that were at odds with Yankee democracy and equality. Furthermore, Joseph, his father, teaches Ethan about Enlightenment theories and philosophers such as Liberty and John Locke, both of which would form the bedrock of patriot arguments against the British in the American Revolution. He makes similar arguments, like I said, in his propaganda against New York in the year before the Revolutionary War. And New York takes on this role, like Britain, of this tyrannical power that's looking to enslave the settlers by robbing them of their property, which in this case is their land. Initially, he took up the Vermonters' cause in my eyes because it was supplementary to his own mission to protect his family, to prevent the enslavement of his own family and the loss of his property to New York. And he's a very self-interested man, and this self-interest guides his allegiance during the Revolutionary War. Now, like most other colonists, he saw George III as the protector of liberty on the eve of the war. He convinced the settlers to petition him for a new colony, a project that he and a local loyalist called Philip Skene were actually successful in achieving, only for the war to intervene and Skene to be arrested as soon as he arrived back with the document that meant the creation of the Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Points colony. They also asked George III if they could possibly be annexed to a new colony, i.e. New Hampshire. At the start of the war, he became an ardent US supporter because he saw overtones of his own mission to achieve liberty. And he hoped that by the settlers and himself showing themselves to be willing servants of the Union, of liberty's cause, the Continental Congress would accept the New Hampshire Grants into the Union and they would validate their lands. Congress, however, continually rebuffs the grants, and it continually kicks the can down the road because they've also got New York getting on their back, telling them that they want this problem solved. And when Allen returns in 1778, he continues to push Congress for Vermont's inclusion. But the Congress makes short shrift of that. They hurt the man, and I would say this very proud man, because he turns up at a meeting in 1778. And he's turned away by Continental Congress because they believe that he is not a representative of a legitimate independent state. So for it would have been quite a hurtful thing for someone like Ethan Allen, I believe. Nevertheless, he continues to push Congress for acceptance, and the Congress just continued to stonewall him. And he grows disillusioned with the Congress, and other episodes take place. For example, it starts planning the Vermont's decimation in the event of a US victory, and refuses the settlers access to Continental Army arsenal in the event of a second British invasion. So it's almost in Vermont and Ethan Allen's eyes like the US is willing to sacrifice the Vermonters and Ethan Allen to the British. Britain watched this with interest. They watch Allen's relationship with the Continental Congress collapse, and in their mind, because his relationship collapses, Vermont's relationships collapse, because he's seen as the leading man of Vermont. And in 1780, they approach Ethan Allen with a proposal where they say, essentially, if you give up your allegiance to the Union, we will give you your land, we'll validate it, and we'll erect a colony, Vermont into a colony. Now, Allen's a very shrewd man, and he sees there's a twin threat here. There's one from the south, from the Continental Congress in New York, but there's also one from the north, from Britain. And he sincerely hopes the US would accept Vermont. He makes that clear in his negotiations with Britain. But at the same time, he's also not holding his breath, as the quote suggests. He's really pushed to the limits here. He doesn't know what to do except persevere. And so he plays Vermont, he plays the US and Britain off one another. And he does this by firstly creating a Vermont empire in the United States of America. That's a tiny wee empire after they annexed the eastern part of New York and a western part of New Hampshire. And so that's called the Greater Vermont. Simultaneously, he's continually in correspondence with Congress, telling Congress, nothing's happening, there's nothing to see here. We are more than committed to the cause. And ultimately, what he's doing is he's playing for time, and he achieves it because the US victory in 1781 renders the talk useless, and the US and Britain neither have invaded Vermont, and Vermont remains an independent state until 1791. How do we then describe Allen's allegiance? Foremost allegiance was to his family, and therefore the protection of his land, in my opinion. It occupied the top mantle throughout the whole of the war, and even after the war. At some point, though, I think he became sincerely attached to the Vermonters. And I think that's around maybe 1778 when he returns. And he starts to, they start to share the top mantle with his family. With respect to the US and Britain, like I said, he sincerely hoped that the US would accept Vermont into the Union, but that it never comes. And it's almost like he sees it as he's not betrayed America, like what some historians are going to argue, but America's betrayed him. And so it's all down to this idea of self-preservation and protecting his family's liberty from the tyranny of the North and tyranny of the South and possible enslavement. As for the British, to me, I think he was a means to an end. He had no real emotional attachment to Britain, and the British negotiators recognised this in Canada. They realised that he's just simply using us to get into the Union. And this is when people say, well, why are you doing this? Because it's with regards to you're doing loyalism. Well, it's been I have to blame the pandemic for that. And so, yeah, this idea of allegiance, it's a very interesting thing, I believe, a very interesting topic. And it makes me start to question other ideas, like we need to start getting away from this idea of there's only three ways of considering allegiance, i.e. these two sides, and then the middle is neutrality, and rather look at more self-interest and localism and influence in how someone allies themselves during a revolution and during a war. And so hopefully I can start to tie that in with my research on loyalism in the years to come. And so thanks for listening today. Thank you to the UEA for providing me with a platform. Shout out to Kat Bide, my St Andrews alumni, who came along tonight to listen to me. And yeah, in the event that I've piqued your interest in Vermont somehow, I'll put up a little secondary reading list for you, and just in case you're interested, with my own shameless self-promotion at the bottom there. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Look forward to the questions and feedback.
Thank you so much, Benjamin, for that. You couldn't hear us, but we really enjoyed your account of Ethan Allen ever so much. It was very entertaining, and it's really clear. Like you're so right about the sort of discrepancies between, sort of allegiances are not black and white at all, are they? So it's a really interesting topic. So we'll come back to Benjamin for questions at the end as well. Now we're going to go straight onto Sandra's paper. Okay, so Sandra came to UEA when she decided to return to study after she retired. She completed an MA in 2016 and began part-time doctoral research in 2018 with an initial interest in communities of women involved in charitable work and education. By 2019, it became clear that she wanted a change of focus with a new approach, and Dr Millie Cockayne became her supervisor, and we're delighted to welcome Millie online tonight as well. Since then, Sandra has been working on the material worlds of 3 17th century women, and Mary Astell is one of these. And that's who Sandra will be talking about tonight. So I hand over to Sandra.
Right, and that's the, yeah, got it. Thanks. Okay, before I start, can I just offer thanks to Louise for organising these seminars, which is obviously taking a lot of her time. And also, yes, personally, Louise, thank you for your support and encouragement. Right, so this piece of work is one part of my research into single women in the 17th century, especially women who never married, lifelong single women, as Amy Freud called them in her 2007 study, Never Married. Astell is one of 3 case studies of women for whom staying unmarried was a clear choice. Historians such as Bridget Hill and Alban Houghton have remarked that spinsters were a significant element in the population at this time. In popular literature, these women were usually presented as distressed and embittered, but they were not a homogenous group, and clearly there would have been many different reasons for their not marrying, some positive and others not. The women I am studying, as I said, made a positive choice not to marry. And my focus is not on why they made this choice, but on how each of them made it work in practice. So it's about their agency and their control within their material worlds. I'm exploring how they use the means at their disposal to achieve independence and control. Mary Astell has been identified by Bridget Hill and other feminist historians as the first English feminist because of her arguments for women's education and her criticism of contemporary marriage. I think this label feminist is perhaps a problematic term, and we might like to discuss that a bit later. This image is unfortunately not of Mary Astell because there are no known images of her. This lady is more richly dressed than Astell would have been, and the furnishings in the room are finer than she would have had in her lodgings in Chelsea. But probably the bookshelves are right. So Ruth Perry wrote a very full biography of Astell in 1986, The Celebrated Mary Astell, which is still the best introduction to her. But just to give you a brief outline here, she was the daughter of a well-established merchant in Newcastle upon Tyne. After her father's death, when she was 12, the family fortunes declined. She had been given some education by her uncle Ralph Astell, who was a curate at St Nicholas Church in Newcastle. He was a Cambridge graduate and a follower of the Cambridge Platonist school. They argued that the nature of the universe was spiritual rather than material, and that moral virtues and human reason were God-given, mortal life was meaningless, and intellectual reasoning was the way to God. Now, Astell plainly loved learning. She absorbed Uncle Ralph's Neoplatonist philosophy, and as a young girl, she wrote religious poetry. At the age of 22, in 1688, she moved to London and lived in Chelsea for most of her life. This was a brave move by a young single woman. It's apparent that she intended to make her way as a published author and to join in the philosophical, political and religious discourses at that time. The evidence we have shows that she sought support from William Sancroft, the Archbishop of Canterbury, fairly soon after her arrival. She wrote asking for his help, saying that she'd pawned all her clothes and had nothing left in the world, though it's clear she kept some of her books. So this is the earliest Astle book which we have, which is actually in the Bodleian Library, not Magdalen, and it's not from the newly discovered Magdalen collection. It's her gift to Archbishop Sancroft, thanking him for the help he's given her. It's a handwritten and hand-stitched collection of her own religious poetry, but it's not now in the form that she sent it to Sancroft. So we have this dull little book, which the Bodleian explained was rebound in the 19th century. Astell describes it in her covering letter to Sancroft as an humble tender of another offering, which though but of goat's hair and badger skins is the best I have to give. So we see her using skills which were appropriately womanly, both practically and emotionally. Her description of the covering as badger skins and goat's hair she took from God's commandments to Moses for sacrifices from the Hebrews. The badger skins is apparently a mistranslation in the James Bible, because there are no badgers in the Middle East. And the Bodleian experts have no knowledge of books from this period bound in badger skins. So it's almost certain that she was not using real badger skin and goat's hair, but creating, as it were, a metaphorical sacrifice to Sancroft as God. But it's woman's work, so it's not a threat to the patriarchal order, but it's flattering to the Archbishop, and it worked. He's likely to have supported her financially and almost certainly gave her an introduction to the conservative printer and publisher Richard Wilkin. Catherine Sutherland, who's the Deputy Librarian at Magdalen College, Cambridge, has newly identified 47 books and pamphlets formerly owned by Astell, and they show her wide range of interests in philosophy, theology, natural science, and political and legal argument. Most Astell scholars are concerned with her work as a philosopher, a natural scientist, and a promoter of women's rights in education and marriage. So, as I said earlier, she's been called the first English feminist. Her first published book was a serious proposal to the ladies by a lover of her sex, and that was published by Wilkin in 1694, in which she argued for the establishment of a community for single women, which would be a sort of cross between a women's college and a convent without vows. Astell scholars concentrate on her published writing, her ideas and her place in contemporary debates. In the newly discovered books, they will examine her marginalia and the notes that she wrote to enlarge our understanding of Astell's ideas and learning and her relationship with other thinkers of the time. My work is on her books as material objects, so I wanted to see what they could show us about how she was living her life in Chelsea, exploring how she used them to advance her aims and her ambitions. In order to do that, I selected 15 books from different dates of ownership, dealing with different subjects. First, I looked at Astell's inscriptions on title pages, and I found the following. There's a noticeable change in her self-identity. In the earliest books, she called herself Philia. So at the age of 13, she wrote claiming ownership in a book she'd almost certainly inherited from her Uncle Ralph, who just recently died. M.A. E Libris Philia, her book, 1679. She'd begun to write religious verse, and adopting a classical pseudonym perhaps indicates that at that age her aspiration was to write pious poetry like Uncle Ralph. Her latest use of that pseudonym in the Magdalen books was in 1697, by which date she had become a published author. From 1697 onwards, she generally wrote M.A. in strong, bold letters, often followed by the purchase date and the price. In several books, she puts the date of purchase and the price she paid. Of the books in the Magdalen collection, at least 10 were bought second-hand. Others were gifts from authors or friends after she'd become well known. I believe that this shows that she was conscious of how much she could spend from a limited fund in the early years of her life in Chelsea. The highest price, which she noted as paying in the books I examined, was 10 shillings for Descartes' Principles of Philosophy, the 1681 French edition, which she bought on July the 9th, 1695. She had been advised by her earliest mentor, John Norris, to learn French so that she could read works by the French philosopher Nicolas Malebranche, but Astell became keen to study Descartes. She wrote extensive notes, marginalia and mathematical calculations in this particular book that she owned. The place of purchase is not, she didn't normally inscribe that, but she wrote Sarum twice in books she had in 1692 and 1695. From the beginning of 1692, John Norris was rector of Bemerton, which is about 2 miles from the centre of Salisbury. Astell had written to Norris, pointing out what she noted was a weakness in his discourses on the love of God. Impressed by her reasoning and with her permission, he published their correspondence in 1695 as letters concerning the love of God. Norris encouraged her studies in philosophy. Previously, the only evidence, hang on just a minute, previously the only evidence of her 1695 visit to Salisbury was that was the first visit she'd made, apparently. It's over 80 miles from London to Salisbury, so her visits must have involved overnight stops and expenses. So at this earliest date, it shows, I believe, how determined she was to exchange ideas with a learned man whose ideas interested her. I need to do more research on travel, and I welcome any pointers towards more useful sources for that, both land and also river transport on the Thames, which I think Astell must have made use of. Did she have any acquaintances in the area other than Norris? There is no evidence discovered to date. So then looking at Astell's interaction with printed texts. She inscribed her copy of this book, A Natural History of the Earth by Professor John Woodward of Gresham College and a member of the Royal Society, M.A. March 4th, 1694-5 in large, bold ink. It had only just been published, so she'd almost certainly either bought it new or perhaps it was a gift from her publisher, Richard Wilkin, who had supported her from the start of her writing career. As a woman, Astell couldn't use learned libraries or join in meetings and discussions in learned societies, and Perry suggests, I think convincingly, that she would have spent time in bookshops browsing and engaging in discussions with others there. In this book, and I'm sorry it's not a very good image, but there was I had a difficulty about getting images from Magdalen College, which I won't bore you with. In this book, Woodward, this is a page from Woodward's book, was explaining the effect of the flood on the earth. Astell was engaging with material science, and as this image shows, she was well, you can't read it, of course, I'm sorry about that, but take my word for it. She was questioning Woodward's theories, identifying an apparent anomaly in his account. So she's a woman, not a scholar, and with no access to learned libraries, questioning this expert who was a professor of physics and using this book as a text for her own study with page references and so on. Astle was bold in her approach to learned men, and I argue that it is likely that she wrote to Professor Woodward to challenge his ideas. We know from a letter written to Francis Atterbury, the Bishop of Rochester, that she sent him comments on one of his sermons. He said, "She attacks me very home, is now and then a little offensive and shocking in her expressions." We know that Norris was impressed by her arguments, and as Atterbury's comment shows, she was quick to send a written response when she had something to say to a man who she disagreed with. I argue that the use she made of the books I examined as scholars' working texts indicates that she would have written to other men as she did to Norris and Atterbury. Why are there no such letters existing? I think you can picture the response. "Damned woman, and into the fire with it." So, the notes she made in Woodward's book were in pencil, which she could alter or erase using a piece of bread rubbed into a little ball. When she needed a more permanent note, she used ink. She invested a lot of time in this book by Bishop Burnet, published 17 years before, which she bought on the 9th of May 1690 for 3 shillings and 6pence. In ink, in small writing on the upper paste down, she summarised the argument of Burnet's book as justification for supreme powers, right or obligation to impose in the affairs of religion as another. Now, this was a potentially useful book for Astell, who was a Jacobite opposed to William III, and you'll note the date, 1690. Generally speaking, in the books which I looked at, her pencil comments were made, I think, as she was reading, as her first response to the text. Writing in pencil, as I said, could be altered or amended later. Here, at the beginning of her copy, she was writing a summary in ink, having finished it. But the next slide shows just how much work she invested in Burnet's book. This shows how hard she worked at the texts she felt were important and which she could make use of. The addition of an index, which she wrote at the back of the book, had in fact the addition of indexes and indices in published books had become more common, and it had even become the subject of satires. It was said you could read the index and not have to read the actual book itself. But we can draw several conclusions, I think, from Astle's work on Burnet's book. In order to compile this index, she must have had plenty of time to do the work and a quiet space allowing her to do it. She must have used pieces of paper, probably scraps, to compile this. There's a debate about how available and expensive paper was at this time, and we know that all kinds of scrap paper were used, for example, as food wrappings. We also know that Astell was careful with her money in her early years in Chelsea, so it's most likely that she would have used those kind of odd scraps in compiling this index. So how Astell used her books and what that tells us. Astell was determined to succeed as a serious thinker and writer. That was her strategy for life as a lifelong single woman. She bought second-hand books to use as scholars' working texts. She engaged informally in debates through discussions and correspondence, as well as through the books which she had published. She had achieved recognition, becoming the celebrated Mrs. Astell and the learned Mrs. Astell before the end of the century, and was taken up by a small group of elite single women who supported her financially and practically. Other books in the Magdalen collection, which I haven't had time to discuss, show this from the dedications which she recorded at the beginning. These women shared Astell's high Tory Anglican beliefs and also the importance that she placed on women's education. To achieve these things, she needed space, time, and what Virginia Woolf 200 years later described as grossly material things like health and money and the houses we live in. These were things she would certainly not have had in her own control if she had married and had not chosen to be a lifelong single woman. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. It's such an interesting alternative way of looking at her books, such a good insight. So I will stop sharing the screen here.
Well, I'm busy.
I'm going to invite Sandra back up again, I'm afraid, so we can take questions for both of our speakers. So, yes, and we'll get Danny's going to pass the line around as well, because that's very important at this end.
So I can't get you. Do you want more room?
Okay. Right, so whilst we're refreshing on refreshments at this end, online group, you can type your questions into the chat box and I can read them out to our speakers. Benjamin, we can see you and probably hear you as well, so that's all good.
Excellent.
Good. So, do you have any questions for our speakers whilst you're being refreshed? I can start us off with a question for Benjamin. I'm really interested, at what stage are you in your thesis? Is this sort of very early stages, or whereabouts are you?
Yeah, so I'm in second year now, and I've done about 2 chapters because up to now all my sources have been online, thankfully. But now I'm getting to the stage where I need to kind of get out to see my sources, and so it really is at the mercy of the pandemic. Even getting out to America now, I need to hope that I don't test positive.
Yes, of course.
So, or another lockdown happens, and so it's almost like it's going on a sort of a whim, and yeah.
I'm interested because obviously you gave such a detailed account of Ethan Allen, and he obviously really piques your interest as a person, and how you're talking about sort of the idea of loyalists and allegiances are so complicated and so personal.
Yeah.
So do you think you're going to take the point of view of lots of little biographies to sort of build up that kind of argument, or what kind of approach are you going to be able to do with that?
Yeah, you see, again, it's we've actually had to construct different plans in the event of something happening. And one of the plans does include a series of biographies. So, for example, Ethan Allen, Philip Skeen, Justice Sherwood, who was a loyalist agent in New Hampshire Grants and in Vermont, and I believe Colonel William Marsh, who ended up switching sides and became a loyalist. So I've got all these different biographies. The other option was to do a sort of micro history, and kind of explore all the small towns throughout Vermont once I get out there. But it's just got to wait and see what happens.
Yeah, see which one works best. Yes, it's a difficult one because it's sort of quite theoretical, but also could be quite personal, individual as well. Yeah. Any other questions? Danny?
So Benjamin, that was fantastic. Very interesting.
Thank you.
So, how does this tradition of independence and possible question of loyalty continue after the revolution and into the 1812 conflict? Or is there any evidence of this continuing?
So I've not really went far into the 1812 conflict, but the idea of independence, it's a weird one, because in the 19th century, the elite in Vermont almost have it's like American patriotism, but in Vermont, it's Vermont patriotism, and it's they treat Vermont as if it's this national identity rather than the state identity, and they use the likes of Ethan Allen and independence in order to push people on in the 19th century, because it's a very turbulent time for the state, multiple social crises, the Civil War. So they used independence as a way to try and bring people together, namely in Vermont rather than in America. I've not really looked at the 1812 war yet, to be honest with you. That was more something I'd covered in the literature review. Thank you for the question. I hope I answered that.
Very good.
Sandra, what happens to her books after her death? Is she intending certain loyalty to certain people?
Her earliest biographer, who was a man called George Ballard, who was attempting to write a biography of her about 10 years after her death, said that she'd given her library to Magdalen College. Now, there was a lot of confusion about which Magdalen College was meant, and nobody could trace any of her books at Magdalen College in Oxford. Some of her books surfaced in Northampton Records Office, having been given originally to her executrix. Her will's never been found, by the way, which is a real sadness. But anyway, she had an executrix, a woman called Elizabeth Hutchison, who lived at a place called Kingscliff. And Kingscliff had a public library. Elizabeth Hutchison gave some books that had belonged to Astle to the Kingscliff Public Library, and they got passed on to the Northampton Record Office. So yes, some of her books were known about before, but Catherine Sutherland, who has been brilliant about this, I mean, she's written a very full, very interesting article, which is going to be published, a paper which is going to be published in the library later this year, and she's been very helpful. She she was doing a provenance survey, I think they call it, of the old library at Magdalen in Cambridge, and I think she just happened to identify, I mean, you know, hats off to her, she happened to identify books in the subjects that she knew Astle would have had an interest in, that had her inscriptions and could easily, and her writing, and could easily be shown to belong to her. So that's why she's got, you know, we now have newly discovered these 47 books and pamphlets, which, you know, is just amazing for Astle scholars who want to look at her ideas, because she used them all, you know, Astle just kept writing, and she didn't write in the posh books that she'd been given by, you know, one or two other authors who admired her. Gave her a book, and she just noted that she'd been given by the learned author. But a lot of the books that she bought second-hand, she just made all these notes in, which is, you know, really good for people who want to study her ideas.
Fantastic resource, isn't it?
Yeah.
We'll take an online question though. We've got one from Oren online, which is another question for Sandra, which says, a bit of a general question for Sandra. In light of your research, what would you say about the relationship in this period between manuscript and print culture? It's notable how handwritten and printed works sort of interact between the two.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, which people always say when they don't really know the answer to. I think a lot of work is being done now, Oren, which I haven't really a deal of knowledge of, about how you can talk about women's authorship just by their relationship. It's a kind of, it's not direct authorship, but what they write in books and how they curate the books that they've got is a kind of authorship. So manuscript and print culture, well, there's Astle's manuscript that she gave to Sancroft and made, you know, obviously made an impression on him with. I'd like to hear more. I'd like someone else to tell me about that, because I don't really know the answer. Sorry.
That's where you go next.
I've got to move on.
Just a question for Ben. Thanks for the interesting paper. I know nothing about it, so sorry for the question. But you mentioned Alan's kind of self-mythologizing tendencies. In what ways, I mean, he sounds like a bit of an outrageous, you know, drunk, you know, eccentric, I suppose. But in what ways did he try to mythologize himself? I mean, you talked about print. I mean, did he try and, you know, actually publish himself as this kind of character? Or, you know, I don't know. How did he become the figure, I suppose, in Vermont?
Yeah. Back to your question. Yeah. So he released quite a lot of propaganda pamphlets in the 1770s, and one of them was captivity in America and in Britain. And so he paints this picture of this ultra patriot kind of guy, this very brave man. But he also used it through word of mouth as well. Like he'd go around Vermont and spread these stories. I think there was one such story that got spread about, I think by him, was he got bitten by a snake, and I think it was he's drunk in the forest and he's sleeping and a snake bites him in the neck. And then he wakes up and he doesn't feel a thing. He's no idea the snake's bit him. The other version of the story is he gets bitten in the neck and the snake dies. A think well, the problem as well is that he's mythologized himself, but Vermont historians for centuries have been obsessed over this man, and especially in, like I was saying, about the 19th century. These historians whose direct ancestors were like colleagues and they fought with Ethan Allen, they've used the stories that they've written with him to put into their own works, and it's really mythologized them, so it's all like kind of smoke and mirrors with it, and you don't really know what's right and what's wrong with regards to what's true and real and anything like that. And he would have wanted it that way as well, and it started with his youngest brother, Ira, who wrote the first kind of history of Vermont in the 1790s, who started making these stories up as well and spreading them. So yeah, it was kind of a contributor. It was a mixture of things, including his own writing.
Thank you.
I'm intrigued. How did you come onto your topic, Benjamin? How did you find what led you to Vermont and Ethan Allen?
So actually, my original project was on the reintegration of Loyalists into post-war USA after the Revolutionary War, and I was looking for funding at the time, and I'm doing this reading and that, and I'm starting to realise if I want to get funding, I need to make the project much more viable. When right now I'd be going around all 13 colonies, and it's nearly double half. And so I'm doing the reading, and then I start to realise that Vermont is conspicuously absent from all the histories. No one's really written about it, and then let's say about the historians, some actually admit to ignoring it. So I kind of thought, yeah, I'll have a look at Vermont, and I'd also been to Vermont in 2010, so that kind of just sparked my imagination a wee bit as well. So I was reading, I thought, oh, well, what about Vermont, and see what they say about that, and then it just kind of led one thing to another, and here we are.
As all the best things do.
Exactly.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I was going to ask, sorry, about, you talked about her being gifted lots of books. It's a really basic question, yeah, but how much would, one of the books, any of the books which we know were hers, would cost at this time, in I suppose, relation to, a wage or something?
Well, I mean, I think the price that Astle paid would probably, although she wasn't loaded by any means, she was struggling, managing on little money. But I mean, as I understand it, ordinary working folk would have been happy for a shilling or a couple of pennies. But so I think she was actually spending, compared with ordinary folk, quite a lot. But the books that she was gifted, I mean, there's a set of 8, I think it's 8, it might be 10 books, which she was given by her wealthy neighbour in Chelsea as a bequest when this lady called Elizabeth Methuen, who'd lived next door to her, died. She was given these 8 books in Methuen's will, and they're all beautifully bound, and that was one of the ways that Catherine Sutherland identified them, because they had the same binding, so they were obviously part of a set that she'd owned, and she'd written in them that they were the bequest of her dear neighbour who departed, blah, blah, blah. I don't honestly know enough about the value of books at the time. It's something I'd like to know more about. But I mean, bear in mind that my work on Astle is just one part of, other stuff, lots of other stuff. If anybody else knows anything about the value of books at that time, it'd be great to hear. No? Oh.
Question for a future date.
Well, yes, I mean, the books that she was gifted were obviously nice books. She bought, I mean, there was 1 or 2 that were really tatty that I looked at that didn't really have anything of worth. There was the one about Oliver Cromwell that I told you about, Lisa, and it was just such a tatty little book that she'd obviously, picked up on a second-hand bookstall, and I suppose for a few pence. But no, I don't know the relative value of books, I'm afraid. I wish I did.
And I guess their value as well, sort of intellectually, might not even be sort of material value if they're of interest, even as a certain type of value.
And she picked the books that she thought would help her in what she wanted to do.
Definitely.
Okay. Well, thank you ever so much again to our two speakers. Another round of applause. And I will share the PowerPoint for next week. So thank you ever so much again for coming along this week. I hope you enjoyed the two papers that we had. Next week we've got, again, it's another hybrid seminar series, so if you can't join us in person, we'd love it if you can join us online. But we've got both of our speakers are from UEA, and they're both going to be in the room with us. We've got Chris Spinks is speaking in person on News of the World, Portrayal and Interpretation of Post-Punk Musicians within the Popular Music Press. So we're moving a little bit away from what we've been doing this week. And we've also got Scott Rawlinson, who's actually from politics, but he's doing the Plebs in Peterborough, Marxism, Working Class Education and Local Party Politics, a case study of Frank and Winifred Horrobin in Peterborough between 1926 and 1932. So we've gone a lot further forward in the future next week. But thank you ever so much again for joining us, and I will end the recording.